From Speculative to Dialectical Thinking, Hegel and Adorno by Gillian Rose. The truth is thus the bacchanalian revel in which no member is not drunk. Yet, because each member collapses as soon as he drops out, the revel is just as much transparent in simple repose. Judged in the court of this movement, the single shapes of the spirit do not persist any more than determinate thoughts do, but they are as much positive and necessary movements as they are negative and evanescent. In the whole of the movement, seen as a state of repose, what distinguishes itself therein and gives itself particular existence is preserved as something that recollects itself, whose existence is self-knowledge, and whose self-knowledge is just as immediately existence. However, such dialectic is no longer reconcilable with Hegel. Its motion does not tend to the identity in the difference between each object and its concept. Instead, it is suspicious of all identity. Its logic is one of disintegration, of the prepared and objectified form and the concepts which the cognitive subject faces, primarily indirectly. Their identity with the subject is untruth. With this untruth, the subject pre-formation of the phenomenon moves in front of the non-identical in the phenomenon in front of the individuum ineffable. Dialectic is the self-consciousness of the objective context of diffusion. It does not mean to have escaped from that context. Its objective goal is to break out of the context from within. The absolute, as it hovers before metaphysics, would be the non-identical that refuses to emerge until the compulsion of identity has dissolved. It lies in the definition of negative dialectic that it will not come to rest in itself as if it were total. This is its form of hope. Truth, for Adorno, is a bacchanalian revel where the alternation of drunkenness and repose seems to have been marked and matched by farewells and welcomes to Hegel. Yet, from the court of Adorno's judgment, the whole is denied any rest, and this inconsistency, for judgment must arrest, reveals that the judge is not compos mentis, for he thereby refuses to acknowledge that in his act particular existence recollects itself, whose existence is self-knowledge, and whose self-knowledge is just as immediately existence. Whereas in this passage from Hegel we have to the revel and the judgment, in particular recollection the whole, in Adorno we have but the judgment. In this paper, I shall discuss how Adorno reduces speculative to dialectical thinking, replacing recollection of the whole by judged oppositions. I shall argue that in Dialectic of Enlightenment, he employs Nietzsche to repudiate Lukács's Hegelianism, and subsequently, in Negative Dialectics, he repudiates Hegel's speculation directly. This argument turns on the distinction between speculative and dialectical thinking, which will itself be developed in the course of this paper abstractly, dialectically, and speculatively in this way. Adorno's position may itself be comprehended within the whole and within the tradition as he adjudicatively retrieves and undermines it. If nowadays it becomes de rigueur to call on Nietzsche as a witness against Hegel, Adorno bears a special responsibility for inaugurating this trial of wits both within critical theory and in rival camps. Yet, both the repudiation of Hegel and the representation of Nietzsche as radical alternative rest on partial and one-sided characterizations of their thinking instead of comprehensive reconstruction. The positions imputed to Nietzsche against Hegel may be listed under the following headings: genealogy to progressive philosophy of history, values to the concept, the singular to the universal, perspectivism to the whole is the true, repetition to reflection, will the power to philosophy of right. While Hegel is said to have disposed absolute closed teleological reappropriated knowledge, Nietzsche is said to propose plural, open, differential creation of new values. President Sunday unironically believes this. Anyways, instead of further defining and challenging these exclusive polar oppositions, the issue here is to discern a tertium comparativus from which the endeavor of Hegel and Nietzsche may be comprehended and not dogmatically contrasted. Both the form and content of Hegel and of Nietzsche's thinking may be grasped as a response to the opposition of Kant's practical philosophy: autonomy, heteronomy, morality and legality, freedom to necessity. I will suggest 5 beginnings for comprehension on this basis. First, both Hegel and Nietzsche trace Kant's opposition to the ethical life or custom of morality, which anticipates the apparently categorical moral imperative. In both cases, the self-declaiming, unconditioned, penetrating iron voice of the categorical imperative turns out to be the result of a long, historical, and linguistically determinate conditioning. In the second place, both Hegel and Nietzsche represent this discipline of morality in terms of Bildung. That is, they expound or narrate, if you wish, the culture of history and the history of culturing. This accounting for the development of morality opens up the apparent unconditioned oppositions which have been formed by negotiation or lack of it. That is, by experience. It addresses and would school the negotiating potential of the reader. In the third place, the modality of this exposition, its justification in Kant's terms, its phenomenology in Hegel's, its genealogy in Nietzsche's, depends on the legal language in which experience and discourse is inexplicably couched. Exposition takes the form of history, of juxtaposed, simultaneous, and successive legal epochs. Fourth, in both cases, it is the enabling and the constricting consequences of this legalism for human agency and human self-understanding which is expounded, especially the power and impotence, the politicizing and the depoliticizing of persons bearer of legal rights and duties. Finally, this attempt to know and to acknowledge the implication of the knower is ironic, expressed by Nietzsche's conscious of method, and by Hegel's absolute method, equally self-canceling phrases. For an immortalist could have no conscious, while no method could be absolute. In these ways, die Gerechtigkeit, justice is insinuated but not posited, Hegel, not legislated, Nietzsche. If the thinking of Hegel and of Nietzsche is constructed comprehensively and speculatively, then the original project of critical theory, following Marx, to reassess the stance toward the Hegelian dialectic of its age, may take on a different complexion. Okay, so this is pushing back against Adorno by saying that basically he reduces Hegel's richer notion of speculative thinking. Hegel did call his philosophy speculative philosophy, not dialectic philosophy, I guess. I don't know if it's related, it's just something I thought about. To the narrow activity of dialectic critique. Okay, Hegel technically only defines the dialectic as one stage of thought. Contradiction is not the endpoint, but a moment that leads towards a higher comprehension in which opposing terms are grasped together. Hegel's infamous image of truth is what captures this moment. That's what the thing to start. I was a little confused. The truth is thus the bacchanalian revel in which no member is not drunk. The revel is just as much transparent and simple repose. I was confused about that, but what that means is that the bacchanal refers to a world of constant movement, conflict, and transformation. Yet, it is not mere chaos, because every disappearing moment is preserved or recollected within this whole. And so contradiction or the negation is in this way sort of a productive force. Not because it combines together to make a positive, but because contradiction itself is more or less, I guess, this sort of ontological engine or something like that, I'm guessing. Adorno abandons the speculative moment, and instead of using contradiction to understand how opposites belong together, he ends up remaining at the level of judging contradictions. And that's why he constantly opposes between identity and non-identity, universal particular, subject and object, rather than showing how these oppositions develop through one another. So, and no, this is saying Adorno is insufficiently critical, as saying that he treats contradiction as a sort of permanent, irreconcilable thing, instead of seeing contradiction as part of a larger movement. Anyway, section 2. After Marx, it was Lukács who defended and developed the analysis of the capitalist labor relation by turning it into the speculative and comprehensive exposition of capitalism as a social structure. Its famous apology for Marxism as a method, even imagining all its theses disproved, was not a version of the return to Kant's current at the time, but a speculative presentation of the whole is the true, of what he called the totality and its mediations. For Lukács, the commodity, universal and conditioned, focus yet fragment on the whole, corresponded to the type of legal rational domination expounded by Weber. Since Weber's sociology of domination and its legitimization is rooted in Nietzsche, Lukács' mobilization of it brought will to power into the speculative exposition of capitalism as a social system and as a culture. In Weber, the predominance of modern bureaucracy is the nub of the analysis of the social and political paralysis engendered by rationalization. However, bureaucracy is only an exemplar of this type of legal rational authority, for there can be traditional bureaucracies, and there are other examples of legal rational authority. From this central thesis of Lukács, History and Class Consciousness, reification in the consciousness of the proletariat, it emerges that if money is taken as the commodity of commodities, then it is qualified exactly to fulfill this ideal type of legal rational authority. Weber's criteria for this type of universality, impersonality, and rationality corresponds, respectively, to the four functions of money enumerated by Marx: standard or price, medium of exchange, and the measure of value and means of payment. In turn, the universality of the standard arises out of particular concrete relations. The impersonality of the medium of exchange requires persons as legal barriers. The rationality or calculability or of the measure of value and means of payment depends on the actual inequality of people or on the irrationality intrinsic to the capitalist mode of production. Lukács shows that exposition of the universalization of commodity relations and of legitimate domination complement each other. They are not metaphysically or sociologically incompatible. Their ineluctable confrontation with legal forms is at the heart of the speculative exposition. The commodity has and is the form of legal rational domination. Furthermore, Lukács shows not just that capitalism reifies social relations, but that capital posits people as persons and as things. It reifies and personifies them. Every individual is a bearer of legal rights and obligations, and hence of commodities and money, a person. But those who do not own the means of production are also things. They have to treat their own labor power as a commodity, as a thing. Things, in their turn, also become personified, the phantasmagoria of the marketplace. Reification and personification imply each other. They are legal categories and social correlatives. This mode of exposition does not presuppose a subject-object dichotomy nor any utopian perspective. It comprehends legal dichotomies speculatively, as the illusory third term in a contradictory and changing relation. In Lukács' book as a whole, however, the speculative exposition of capitalism is harnessed with a universalist subject-object theory of proletarian politics, which is alternatively voluntarist and partyist. It is the weakness of its strength which discredited the work in the eyes of those such as Ernst Bloch and Adorno, who had been introduced to it by the possibilities of extending the analysis of capitalism as a culture by the converging of motifs from Hegel with motifs from Nietzsche and Weber. In Dialectic Enlightenment, Adorno and Horkheimer develop an account of domination which owes its credentials to Nietzscheanism itself, reduced from speculative to chiastic propositions which elaborate the main thesis. Myth is already enlightenment, enlightenment reverts to mythology. Expressing the dilemma of enlightenment and domination has priority over presenting speculative exposition or Bildung, the relation of universality and particularity as it actually and potentially negotiated by the singular. Even though the original proposition in effect declares its investment in a vigilant enlightenment by balancing enlightenment's reversion to myth with an insistence on myth's cognitive power, the one-dimensional view of domination is born. Culture now impresses the same stamp on everything, or, with respect to Bacon and Luther, power and knowledge are synonymous. This is not to overlook the dialectical strategy of dialectical enlightenment, the exaggeration in such propositions designed to release potential reflections in actions. Nor is it to overlook the propitious negative in the dialectic, the refusal of utopia bought at the cost of overstating unfreedom. On the contrary, Adorno's subsequent strategy of negative dialectic is perfectly consistent with his confessed limitation of thinking too dialectic. What needs developing, however, concerns the way in which the stress of the epithet negative has detracted attention from the larger issue. The dialectical thinking is not speculative thinking. And so what she's getting here is that Lukács actually took Marx's analysis of capitalism and developed it into a speculative account of society as a totality, insisting that Marxism is valuable not simply because individual propositions are true, but because it grasps social relations as an interconnected whole, or in other words, the whole is the true. For Lukács, concepts like commodities, money, law, bureaucracy, and domination are not isolated phenomena, but mediate one another. And so capitalism simultaneously turns people into things, which is what reification actually refers to, while also turning things into social actors. Personification. Reification and personification imply each other. They are legal categories and social correlatives. This is an example of speculative thinking because apparently opposed categories are understood as mutually constituting one another. But Lukács also combines the speculative analysis with a strong theory of revolutionary proletarian consciousness, which to some internally weakened his project. Adorno and Horkheimer, as a result, rejected this framework and dialectic of the Enlightenment, instead reconstructing capitalism as an internally mediated whole where they emphasize domination everywhere. Their characteristic formulation of this being, myth is already enlightenment, enlightenment refers to mythology. This style argument ends up turning dialectics into a series of paradoxes instead of explaining historical development. And so Adorno increasingly presents domination as something universal, where culture is now impresses the same stamp on everything, and as a result, contradiction ceases to generate development and becomes a permanent condition. The main problem here is that dialectical thinking is not speculative thinking. 3. In a letter to Frederick Emanuel Nightinghammer of 23rd October 1812, Hegel takes up the difficult question of how to introduce gymnasium boys to philosophy. The dialectic, as it were, explique aux enfants. Philosophical content has in its method and soul 3 forms. It is 1. Abstract, 2. Dialectical, and 3. Speculative. It is abstract insofar as it takes place generally in the element of thought. Yet, as merely abstract, it becomes, in contrast to the dialectical and speculative forms, the so-called understanding which holds determinations fast and comes to know them in their fixed distinction. The dialectical is the movement and confusion of such fixed determinateness. It is negative reason. The speculative is positive reason. The spiritual, and it alone, is really philosophical. The second stage, the dialectical, is more difficult than the first. The Kantian antinomies contain deep fundamentals of the antinomical content of reason. Yet, these antinomies lie concealed and are recognized in the antinomies, so to speak, unthinkably and insufficiently in their truth. Nothing beyond tortuous antithesis. The third form is the truly speculative form, i.e., knowledge of what is opposed in its very oneness. More precisely, the knowledge that the opposites are in truth one. Only this speculative stage is truly philosophical. It is naturally the most difficult. It is the truth. It is itself present in twofold form. One, in its common form, when it is brought nearer to representation, imagination, and the heart. Though self-consciousness, the practical in general, already contain in and for themselves the principles or beginnings of the speculation, and of spirit and the spiritual there. Moreover, in truth, not even a single non-speculative word that can be said, for spirit is unity, and with itself in otherness. As a rule, when one uses the word soul, spirit, or God, one is speaking all the same, only of stones and coals. What is philosophical in the form of a concept is exclusively what has been grasped conceptually, the speculative proceeding of the dialectic. Adorno, true to Hegel's distinction, confines himself to dialectic, which is the second negative stage of reason. Yet, he denounces dialectic cut short by Hegel, a section heading from negative dialectics. In the passage after passage in negative dialectics, Adorno represents Hegel in terms of opposition, between individual and ideal, or between particular and universal, which Hegel is alleged to have invariably reconciled in favor of the latter term of the opposition against the former. Hegel's transposition of the particular into particularity follows the practice of a society that tolerates the particular only as a category, a form of the supremacy of the universal. It sounds as if Adorno has taken his lesson from the form, not the content of Hegel's letter to Nightenhammer, a letter in which the three stages of thinking are themselves stated abstractly and somewhat dialectically, but not speculatively, except at the beginning. It is the speculative proposition which opens up the irony of history for Hegel, the exposition of the speculative identity and non-identity of the state and religion. This identity and non-identity shows in the craft of his work as the inversion of substance into subject, that is, the inversion of ethical life into modern legal status and morality, which occurs when the state is separated from civil society. Adorno, by contrast, remains with the dialectical antinomies of subject and object, particular and universal, individual and state. While claiming that Hegel is siding with the universal, Adorno does not relate these oppositions to each other as they come to light in a dynamic historical development, but argues that they are frozen, regressions under the spell. He thereby preserves them under the spell and brings mediation to a standstill. This stasis is justified by reference to its historical precondition, which is to dehistoricize that condition. Overall, Adorno construes Hegel as a dialectical dogmatist. Adorno commits the injury, which he has himself identified in Minima Moralia. The harm is done by the thema probandum. The thinker uses the dialectic instead of giving himself up to it. Even the thesis of reification is undermined dialectically. Well, the category of reification, which was inspired by the wistful image of unbroken subjective immediacy, no longer merits the key position accorded to it overzealously by an apologetic thinking. Pure immediacy and fetishism are equally untrue. The insistence on immediacy against reification renounces, as perceived in Hegel's institutionalism, the moment of otherness in dialectics, as arbitrary a procedure as the latter's, Hegel's unfeasible practice to arrest dialectic in something solid beyond it. Yet, the surplus over the subject, which is a subjective metaphysical experience, will not be talked out of. In the element of truth and reality, these two extremes touch in the idea of truth, for there would be no more truth without a subject freeing itself from illusion than there could be truth without that which is not the subject, that in which truth has its archetype. The circularity of this passage acts as a warning. It begins by undermining the speculative implication of reification, indicting it as a nostalgia for immediacy, yet it ends up by affirming the metaphysical archetype. It itself has the form of dialectical reason, which is arrested platonically in the elusive archetype. By refusing to comprehend the antinomy which he enunciates, the move from dialectical to speculative thinking, Adorno is caught up in the illusion with which he will only juggle. That is, he repeats the antinomy and will not comprehend it. This may explain why there is no recognition of law of the third of the development of Sittlichkeit, or morality, in negative dialectics. It may also explain why, under the heading Law and Equality, law is presented solely in terms of the dichotomies of natural law and positive law, abstract legal norm and equity, compulsion of the universal, and defiance of absorption. There is no concept of law because there is no configuration in a third, no law of the concept and its development. The reception and fate of Adorno's work is itself a chapter in the culture of Marxism and of philosophy. At first, ignored, dismissed, and misconstrued, it is now, like Nietzsche's, hailed as the gospel of aporeatics of non-identity with a dying fall of euporia. This smothers any attempt to recognize the universal in the aporia, and the lack of identity in its specificity. Adorno's judgment tries to prevent the Bacchanalian revelers from collapsing with exhaustion so that while he judges, no repose, and thereby reposes illicitly, making an exception of himself, we continue grappling about the stones and coals. Adorno's oeuvre has broadcast the judgment that Hegel justifies totalitarian politics and that Nietzsche's will to power amounts to omnipotence but no potentiality. Adorno does not use the dialectic, but he does judge it. He cannot give himself up to it, for then his thinking would become speculative. For reason he gives himself, he is under the spell, which accounts for the remorseless judgment tone and style of his writing. Adorno kept the dialectic spellbound, so that when later postmodern generations insisted again on a revel without repose, their inevitable judgment may arrest their own inconsistency. If even only abstractly and dialectically, this paper has begun to undo the spell. Speculative beginnings may be released and coaxed to take up the labor of the concept. After the debilitations of the dance, the labor, which is equally repose, may refresh us. Okay, this is kind of like the main part of the essay. So, we distinguish between three forms of thought: abstract, dialectical, and speculative thought. And they're defined as follows. Abstract thinking fixes concepts in rigid separation. Dialectical thinking reveals the instability and contradiction of those fixed concepts, and speculative thinking then comprehends opposing terms in their unity. The speculative is knowledge of what is opposed in its very oneness. Only the speculative stage is truly philosophical. That's the quote from Hegel on this. So, Adorno, true to Hegel's distinction, confines with the dialectic, which is the second negative stage of reason. Okay? I guess that's why he calls it negative dialectics. Adorno repeatedly criticizes Hegel for reconciling contradiction too quickly, but as a result of this, he ends up making the opposite mistake. He refuses reconciliation altogether. He continually opposes individual universe. You heard me earlier, it's a short paper. Adorno leaves these oppositions frozen instead of tracing how they historically generate one another as a consequence of this, and he thereby preserves them under the spell and brings mediation to a standstill. And she even goes as far as to quote Minima Moralia to criticize him, where he says, the harm is done by the thema probandum. The thinker uses the dialectic instead of giving himself up to it. Okay, which means that Adorno consciously employs dialectic as a critical method instead of allowing dialectical movement to carry thought into speculative comprehension. And now there are, entire generations of philosophers who celebrate contradiction, paradox, and non-identity, while neglecting the speculative labor of grasping how a contradiction belongs to a larger historical whole. And I guess this is where it ends in the call to return to Hegel's full conception of thought, where dialectic is not the destination, but the necessary path toward speculative understanding. And this is one of the best papers I've read. I wish more people talked about this. This is kind of crazy.